There is a canyon in Utah where the walls speak. Not metaphorically, not poetically, literally. Carved into the red sandstone, hundreds of feet above the canyon floor, figures that have no business being there. Tall, elongated, without mouths, without ears, without the features of any human face. Surrounded by symbols that match, with uncomfortable precision, the star maps of a culture that did not exist in this region when the carvings were made. Archaeologists have studied them for decades. They have names for the style. They have theories about the people who made them. What they do not have, what no one has, is a satisfying explanation for why these figures look the way they look, or why the Cherokee, 1,000 miles away, have been telling the same story for longer than anyone can measure. A story about visitors, from the sky, from a specific cluster of stars that the Cherokee could identify by name before European contact. Before telescopes, before anyone told them what was up there. This is not a story about belief. This is a story about evidence. And the evidence is older than you think. Begin with the stars, the Pleiades, a cluster of stars in the constellation Taurus, visible to the naked eye on clear nights, known to cultures across the ancient world. The Greeks name them. The Egyptians oriented their pyramids toward them. The Japanese call them Subaru. Yes, that's Subaru. The car company's logo is the Pleiades cluster. But here is what most people do not know. The Cherokee name for the Pleiades translates as the place our people came from. Not the place we look at, not the beautiful stars, the place we came from, the origin point, home. The Cherokee oral tradition, maintained with extraordinary precision across generations, cross-checked by ethnographers who began recording it in the 18th and 19th centuries and found consistent versions across separated communities with no modern contact between them, describes beings who arrived from the Pleiades in the distant past. Not angels, not gods in the traditional sense. Beings, physical beings who traveled, who arrived, who stayed for a time, who interacted with the Cherokee people in ways that were specific, documented, and mutual, who left, and who, according to the tradition, will return. The Cherokee call them the Nunehi in some traditions, the Sky People in others. They are described consistently tall, luminous, capable of appearing and disappearing, capable of existing in a different relationship with physical space than ordinary beings. They arrived in craft, not clouds, not divine light, not metaphor. Craft, objects that moved against the wind, that rose and descended vertically, that left marks on the ground where they landed. The tradition is specific about this. It has always been specific about this. The specificity predates any possible contamination from European contact, from science fiction, from the 20th century vocabulary of UFO culture. The question that no one has adequately answered is simple. How did a pre-contact people, in the forests of what is now the American Southeast, develop a tradition this specific, this consistent, and this directionally accurate, pointing to a real star cluster at a real location in the sky, without a source? Now go to Utah, to the canyon wall, to the figures carved into the sandstone of the San Rafael Swell and 9 Mile Canyon and Barrier Canyon, the sites that archaeologists have catalogued and dated and argued over for a century, without reaching consensus on what exactly they represent. The Barrier Canyon-style petroglyphs are among the oldest in North America, dated conservatively to between 2,000 and 7,000 years ago. Some researchers push the date further. The figures are extraordinary, tall, sometimes 8 or 9 feet in the original carving, with elongated bodies, tapered heads, and a consistent absence of human facial features. No mouths, no ears, no noses in most depictions, large, dark, forward-facing eyes, antenna-like projections from the head in multiple examples. Surrounding the figures, smaller human-scale figures that appear to be approaching or accompanying them, positioned with body language that reads as reverent, as attentive, as receiving something. The figures have been called shamanic. They have been called supernatural beings of indigenous religious practice. They have been called the Holy Ghosts, the informal name given to them by early researchers who were themselves uncertain what they were looking at. None of these labels explains the consistency of the depiction across sites separated by hundreds of miles. None of them explains the antennae. None of them explains why the surrounding human figures are consistently smaller and consistently oriented toward the tall beings, rather than away from them. And none of them explains the star maps. In 2019, a researcher cross-referencing the symbolic elements surrounding the Barrier Canyon figures with astronomical data made a connection that has not been widely reported. The geometric symbols arranged around and above several of the tall figures, symbols that had been interpreted as abstract decoration or unknown ritual markings, correspond, when overlaid on a star chart, to the Pleiades cluster and its surrounding stars, not approximately, not loosely, with a precision that requires either extraordinary coincidence or deliberate astronomical knowledge encoded in the carvings. The people who made the Barrier Canyon carvings were not the Cherokee. They were a different culture, separated by geography and centuries. They had no known contact with the Cherokee tradition. They were carving into Utah sandstone, while the Cherokee tradition was being carried in the forests of the southeast, and both of them were pointing to the same cluster of stars. Both of them were depicting the same category of being, tall, non-human lucinous arriving from above. Both of them were recording, in their respective ways, contact with something that came from the Pleiades. This is the moment where the rational frameworks begin to strain. Not break, strain. The Hopi people of the American Southwest have their own tradition, the Kachina, spirit beings who descend from the sky to interact with humanity, to teach, to guide, to judge. The Hopi Kachina tradition is among the most extensively documented indigenous spiritual practices in North America. It is also, when examined closely, among the most specifically non-metaphorical. The Kachina are not symbolic, they are not allegory, they are, in Hopi understanding, real beings who make real visits, who land, who walk among the people, who leave when they choose to leave. The Kachina masks and ceremonial objects used in Hopi ritual depict these beings. The depictions are consistent across centuries, and they are consistent in specific and measurable ways, with the Barrier Canyon figures carved into Utah sandstone by a people the Hopi have no direct ancestral connection to. The elongated form, the non-human face, the objects carried or worn that do not correspond to any known earthly technology of the period. In 1970, a Hopi elder named White Bear provided testimony to researchers that has since been quoted extensively and contested equally extensively. White Bear described Hopi oral tradition concerning the Kachina as precisely as he was able in translation. He said the Kachina came from the stars. He said they came in physical craft. He said the earliest Hopi were taught specific knowledge by these beings, agricultural, astronomical, and something else he described only as knowledge of time that the ordinary mind cannot hold. He said the Kachina left, but that the tradition of their visits was maintained in the ceremonies, so that when they returned, the people would recognize them. White Bear said this in 1970. He was describing a tradition that predates European contact by centuries. The description matches the Cherokee tradition, which predates European contact by centuries, which points to the same star cluster, which describes the same category of physical being. 3 nations, 3 traditions, 1 direction in the sky. In 2021, a team applying machine learning to the database of North American petroglyphs, over 80,000 catalogued images from sites across the continent, identified a pattern that human researchers working site by site had not fully recognized. A specific category of figure, sharing measurable geometric characteristics, height to width ratio, head shape, the specific absence of facial features, the positioning of surrounding human figures, appears at sites across North America with a frequency and consistency that the algorithm flagged as non-random. The figures cluster, not randomly. They cluster at specific geographic locations, and those locations, when mapped, align with sight lines, elevated positions with clear views of the northeastern sky. The position where the Pleiades rise. The researchers who published these findings were careful. They described the pattern. They declined to explain it. The pattern, they noted, exists. What generated the pattern is a question the data not answer. But the data can tell us this. The people who made these carvings, across different cultures, different centuries, different geographic regions, were looking at the same part of the sky, were depicting the same category of being, were recording, in the permanent medium of stone, something they had seen, or been told about, or both. Something important enough to carve into canyon walls at heights that required considerable effort and risk to reach. They were not doing this casually. They were not doing this abstractly. They were making a record. The question is what they were making a record of. The Cherokee tradition says the sky people will return. The Hopi tradition says the Kachina have never fully left. The Barrier Canyon figures stand in the Utah desert, 8 feet tall, eyeless and mouthless, surrounded by star maps that no one adequately explained for 7,000 years, pointing northeast, pointing toward the Pleiades, pointing toward whatever it was that arrived, and stayed and taught and left. In 1947, something fell near Roswell, New Mexico. The official explanation has changed 3 times. The unofficial conversation has never stopped. Most people think of Roswell as the beginning, the first contact, the first evidence, the first moment humanity encountered something from elsewhere. The canyon walls of Utah suggest otherwise. The Cherokee oral tradition suggests otherwise. The Hopi Kachina tradition suggests otherwise. The machine learning analysis of 80,000 petroglyphs suggests otherwise. Roswell was not the beginning. It was a reminder that something has been here before. that something left records in stone that we are only now learning to read correctly, that the Sky People are not a modern invention, not a product of science fiction and Cold War anxiety and tabloid journalism. They are old, older than writing, older than the civilizations that developed writing, older than our ability to record what we know. They were here. Multiple cultures saw them. Multiple cultures recorded them. Multiple cultures pointed to the same stars. And multiple cultures said they would come back. The petroglyphs are still there. The traditions are still alive. The star cluster rises every night in the northeast, exactly where it has always risen, exactly where thousands of years of carvings have been pointing, waiting perhaps to be recognized, or perhaps simply marking the direction something came from, and the direction something will eventually return. We were told about this. For thousands of years, we were told. We called it mythology and filed it accordingly. The canyon walls did not argue, they just kept pointing. As always, we will see you in the past.